Imagine walking into a medical clinic, right? You feel absolutely dreadful. I mean, the kind of sick where every single joint aches, your breathing is shallow, and you just know fundamentally that something is wrong inside your body.
Yeah, that really visceral, primal feeling of being unwell.
Exactly. So you stagger up to the front desk and you're fully expecting that, within a few minutes, you'll be sitting on an examination table.
Right, you expect the standard medical routine.
Right. You expect a doctor to listen to your lungs with a stethoscope, check your vital signs, palpate your abdomen, and actually use their years of clinical experience to figure out what's failing.
Which is, the basic social contract of healthcare.
But instead, you're greeted by a receptionist or maybe a clinical assistant who uh, barely even looks up from their computer, and they just ask you to rattle off your symptoms while they click through this pre-printed generic flowchart on their screen.
Yeah, just a rigid checklist.
Right. And based entirely on a statistical algorithm without anyone ever laying a physical hand on you, they print out a prescription for antibiotics, hand it across the desk, and dismiss you.
All in, what, maybe 5 minutes?
Under 5 minutes, and you walk out into the parking lot trusting them because, well, they represent the medical system. You assume they know what they're doing.
Sure, you assume the system is built to protect you.
But consider this chilling reality. What if your actual underlying illness didn't fit neatly into the top 70% of statistical probabilities that their software was, programmed to recognize?
That's where it gets terrifying.
Exactly. What happens when you wake up 3 days later in an intensive care unit with life-threatening complications, all because a rigid administrative protocol completely bypassed an actual clinical examination?
Well, it's a profound failure of the basic medical contract. And what we're going to explore today is that this scenario, it isn't some dystopian hypothetical.
No, it's very real.
It is. When healthcare systems decide to prioritize administrative efficiency by relying entirely on these rigid protocols, they don't just change how a clinic operates, they fundamentally alter the epistemology of medicine.
They change what medicine actually is.
Right. They remove the diagnostic intuition, that ability to hear the subtle, complex story of an illness. And that's an intuition that takes decades of rigorous scientific and clinical training to actually develop.
Which brings us directly to the mission of our deep dive today. We are looking at an absolutely massive, just incredibly dense archive of source materials.
Yeah, it is a staggering amount of documentation.
It really is. We're talking about extensive legal filings, transcripts from medical forums, internal policy documents from the UK's National Health Service, the NHS, and some deeply personal excerpts from an autobiography.
And all of these documents, they orbit around the experiences of one specific physician.
Right, Dr. Kadiali M. Srivatsa, who is referred to throughout these files as Dr. Shipker.
Yeah, the sheer volume of the material is overwhelming, but at the absolute center of gravity is a court document. It's officially titled The Torturous Conspiracy Case.
Just a wild title for a legal document.
It is, but it serves as this meticulous chronological legal breakdown of institutional retaliation. But, we're also looking at clinical audits documenting severe medical errors, personal correspondences that capture his profound despair over patient care, and broader surveys on shifting medical ethics.
So the narrative that emerges here is just this catastrophic collision between the ethical conscience of an individual doctor and the self-preserving machinery of a massive bureaucracy.
Exactly. And the core conflict driving all of this is startling. In the early 2000s, Dr. Sri basically blew the whistle on a new initiative within the NHS. It was known as the pilot nurse-led practice.
Right, and he observed that nurses and administrative staff were being licensed to diagnose patients and prescribe medications entirely autonomously.
Yeah, with zero direct supervision from a qualified doctor.
Which is wild. So he documented the immediate dangers. He recorded the patients returning with these severe missed complications, and he formally raised the alarm.
And you would logically assume that a healthcare system would treat a doctor pointing out critical safety flaws as, an asset.
A hero, even.
Right. But instead, he was subjected to a decade-long retaliatory nightmare. And this was orchestrated by the NHS and the General Medical Council, the GMC.
The timeline documented in the files is just harrowing. I mean, he identified systemic wrongdoing, he meticulously followed the established statutory channels to report it, and the very institutions designed to protect public health effectively turned their vast resources against him, just to silence the warning.
Yeah, they decided to crush the messenger rather than fix the system.
Okay, let's really unpack this. I want to dissect exactly how that happens. How does an institution decide to dismantle a whistleblower rather than fix a lethal flaw? But to do that, we have to go back to the origin of the conflict.
Yeah, the catalyst.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Where does this specific shift in patient care actually start?
So the critical flashpoint occurs in 2003 down in Surrey. The NHS was under immense political and financial pressure to modernize at the time.
Sure, healthcare systems are always under pressure.
Exactly. And they were rolling out this pilot nurse-led practice with a very specific administrative goal: efficiency.
It's always about efficiency, isn't it?
Always. The system was strained, waiting times were politically unpopular, and, well, employing doctors is expensive. So the administration's brilliant solution was to train nurses to diagnose common infections and prescribe antibiotics independently.
Theoretically freeing up doctors and moving patients through the queue way faster.
That was the pitch. And Dr. Sri was initially invited to participate in this initiative. He was actually asked to help train and assess the first cohorts of these nurses.
Okay, I want to play devil's advocate here for a second, because on the surface, to a layperson or an administrator, this just sounds like standard delegation, right?
Sure, it sounds perfectly logical on paper.
Yeah, healthcare systems are famously overwhelmed. We see nurse practitioners and physician assistants running clinics all the time now. So if a nurse can handle a basic ear infection or a standard sore throat, shouldn't the system allow them to do that?
So the highly specialized doctors can focus on complex autoimmune diseases or rare cancers.
Exactly. Why was he so fundamentally opposed to delegating the frontline triage?
That is exactly the administrative argument that was used to push the initiative forward. But the distinction the source material makes is really important here. There is a massive gap between a fully trained nurse practitioner who has undergone years of advanced clinical education and the specific model being piloted in Surrey.
Ah, okay. So it was a different caliber of training.
Right. Dr. Sri agreed to participate initially because he thought he could validate some clinical diagnostic tools. But after attempting to train the first 2 batches of nurses for 6 months, he formally refused to certify them as safe to practice independently.
Wait, they were only getting 6 months of training?
Yes. And the fundamental issue was the depth of that training. 6 months is simply inadequate to build the foundational architecture of differential diagnosis.
I mean, doctors go to school for what, nearly a decade?
Exactly. He documented that these specific nurses lacked rigorous grounding in pharmacology, so the mechanics of how drugs interact. They lacked anatomy, biochemistry, microbiology, and pathophysiology.
Wow.
You cannot fast-track the underlying science of how the human body fails. You just can't.
So his objection wasn't to nurses as a profession. It was an objection to this accelerated, diluted training program that asked them to perform a role they simply hadn't been equipped for.
Correct. And the way the administration attempted to bridge that massive gap in clinical knowledge is really the crux of the problem.
How did they try to fix it?
Well, because the nurses, and in some cases even chemists, didn't have the deep medical background to organically deduce a diagnosis from complex symptoms, the system just provided them with statistical protocols.
Oh, these are the checklists we were talking about in the waiting room scenario.
Yes. A protocol is essentially an algorithmic flowchart. It's designed around the reality that, maybe 70 to 80% of patients who walk through a clinic door present with standard, statistically common ailments.
Right, most people just have a cold or a standard bug.
Exactly. So the checklist guides the practitioner down a decision tree. But what Dr. Sri argued, and what the clinical audits later proved, is that this protocol fundamentally replaces the clinical examination.
It takes the physical element right out of it.
Right. Instead of auscultating the lungs, actually listening for the specific crackle of fluid that indicates pneumonia versus the wheeze of asthma, the practitioner is entirely reliant on the binary answers the patient gives to the computer's prompts.
That seems incredibly dangerous. I mean, it's like handing someone a manual on the physics of acoustics and expecting them to tune a grand piano by ear.
That's a great analogy.
Right. The manual tells you how sound works, but without the trained ear, you're just guessing. So how did the medical establishment justify stripping away the physical examination in favor of a computer screen?
Well, the justification was rooted in a very specific interpretation of evidence-based medicine, or EBM, and they combined this with a philosophy called problem-focused nursing.
Okay, break that down for me.
Sure. So, evidence-based medicine is theoretically the gold standard, right? It means using the best current research to make decisions about individual patients. But the critique articulated in these documents is that EBM was being weaponized by administrators
Weaponized how?
to sideline clinical expertise in favor of rigid, easily audited algorithms. It's easier for a manager to check a box than to evaluate a doctor's intuition. And problem-focused nursing narrows the lens entirely onto the immediate, specific symptom a patient complains about.
Which sounds helpful until you realize the body is entirely interconnected.
Exactly. The psychological danger this creates in a clinical setting is a cognitive bias known as anchoring.
Oh, I've read about anchoring in behavioral economics. It's when, like, you fixate on the first number someone offers in a negotiation and you just can't adjust away from it.
Right, you get stuck on the initial data point.
So how does that translate to a medical diagnosis?
It works exactly the same way, but obviously the stakes are life and death.
Hmm.
If a patient comes in and says, I have a terrible cough, the protocol anchors the practitioner onto a respiratory issue pathway.
It locks them in?
Right. The checklist asks questions about mucus, about throat pain, about sinus pressure. But a cough is not a disease. It is a symptom.
Right. A cough could be a million things.
Exactly. A persistent cough can be the primary presentation of congestive heart failure as fluid backs up into the lungs. It can be a side effect of a blood pressure medication like an ACE inhibitor. It can be gastroesophageal reflux disease.
Wow, okay.
But if the practitioner is strictly adhering to a problem-focused protocol, they are prevented from listening to what Dr. Sri calls the story of the illness.
Which means looking at the holistic picture. You have to look at the patient's history, their environment, the subtle physical cues.
Precisely. Medical students spend years learning how to synthesize the narrative a patient tells them with the physical signs their body is displaying.
Yeah, it's an art as much as a science.
Exactly. When you force healthcare through a flowchart, you treat the illness as an isolated data point rather than treating a complex human organism.
And the documents don't just theorize about this danger. They actually catalog the tragic collateral damage. I mean, the clinical audits from this period list deeply disturbing errors that resulted directly from this system.
Yeah, the real-world consequences were severe.
There are instances of missed jaundice documented, and jaundice is a massive red flag for liver failure. But it was being completely overlooked because it wasn't a checkbox on the specific respiratory or gastrointestinal protocol the patient was slotted into.
It is just a catastrophic failure of triage.
Right. Patients were being prescribed the wrong antibiotics, leading to resistance and worsening infections. People were being sent home and returning days later with severe, sometimes irreversible complications because the underlying pathology was entirely missed by the algorithm.
And you mentioned earlier the sources reference studies indicating that medical errors in diagnosis and treatment have escalated to become the third most common cause of death.
It's terrifying. And the environment that fostered these errors, it's detailed in the audits of College Road surgery between 2004 and 2007. Dr. Sri physically audited the workflow, and what he documented was a clinical pressure cooker.
Yeah, the administration had mandated 5-minute consultations.
5 minutes! I mean, by the time an elderly patient takes off their winter coat and sits down, you have perhaps 3 minutes of actual dialogue.
Barely enough time to type in their name, let alone evaluate them.
Right. That is barely enough time to establish eye contact, let alone conduct a differential diagnosis.
And incredibly, it gets worse. The audits show they were actively double booking patients into 10-minute slots.
Oh, come on. That's just a factory line.
It really was.
Yeah.
This created a scenario where receptionist staff with absolutely zero medical training were effectively serving as the primary triage point.
They were the gatekeepers.
Right. They were under immense pressure to manage the overflow, trying to decipher which patients actually needed one of those precious 5-minute slots and which ones could be deflected.
Just guessing, basically.
Pretty much. The documents note that these receptionists found it incredibly difficult to say no to patients who were visibly distressed or demanding to be seen. It created a chaotic, fundamentally unsafe clinical environment. It transformed a healthcare facility into an industrial assembly line prioritized entirely by volume.
If we pull back and look at the structural incentive here, it's terrifying. The system was quite literally prioritizing its own throughput metrics over the actual standard of care.
Metrics look great on a spreadsheet.
Right. They were measuring success by how many bodies moved through the door per hour, not by whether those bodies were actually healed. And Dr. Sri realized that this wasn't just bringing the medical profession into disrepute. It was an active, ongoing threat to human life.
So he does what his oath demands.
Exactly. He initiates the action that defines the rest of his life. He decides to blow the whistle.
Yeah, he took the ethical mandate of his profession very seriously. On February 21st, 2007, he submitted a formal protected disclosure.
And just to clarify for the listener, this is the specific statutory mechanism in UK law for whistleblowing.
Yes, it's a legal framework meant to protect you. He put his extensive clinical concerns, the evidence of diagnostic errors,
Hmm.
and the patient complaints into a formal written record.
Now, you would hope that a system built on evidence and science would look at an audit of misdiagnoses and immediately halt the pilot program to reassess.
You would hope.
But that is not what the documents show. The institutional response wasn't an investigation into the clinical errors. It was an immediate, coordinated counterattack on the doctor who exposed them.
Right. The Primary Care Trust, or PCT, which is the administrative body overseeing the local NHS services, they completely ignored the clinical substance of his disclosure.
Just swept it under the rug.
Worse than that. According to the legal filings, the PCT chairman allegedly took Dr. Shree's confidential complaint and actually informed the very nurses whose clinical competence was being questioned.
He leaked it to them.
Yes. The file suggests the administration actively encouraged those staff members to instigate counterclaims and grievances against Dr. Shree.
They took a clinical safety warning and deliberately weaponized the clinic staff against the whistleblower. I mean, that is a staggering breach of administrative ethics. How does management justify ignoring clinical data in favor of starting a turf war?
To understand that, we have to analyze the psychology and the composition of the management structure itself. The source materials emphasize a crucial detail here. The PCT executives and the hospital managers who were reviewing Dr. Shree's clinical notes and his protected disclosures, they were not clinicians.
Wait, the people evaluating a complaint about advanced diagnostic failures had absolutely no medical training themselves.
None whatsoever. They were career administrators.
That explains so much.
Doesn't it? They literally lacked the specialized knowledge required to comprehend the gravity of a missed jaundice diagnosis or the pharmacological dangers of incorrect antibiotic prescribing. Their professional reality was governed entirely by key performance indicator.
KPIs, the bane of modern existence.
Exactly. Specifically, patient satisfaction metrics and wait times.
That explains the disconnect perfectly. To an administrator, a patient who gets seen in under 10 minutes and leaves with a tangible item like a prescription is a satisfied customer on a survey.
Yep, they check the box. Success.
Right. The fact that the prescription is useless and the patient might end up in an emergency room 3 weeks later with sepsis doesn't show up on that clinic's immediate quarterly report.
No, it's categorized as a completely separate incident down the line.
So the managers couldn't see the systemic medical failure. They only saw an uncooperative doctor who was creating friction in their perfectly designed assembly line.
Exactly the case. And the clinicians on the ground, the frontline doctors, they were acutely aware of this dynamic.
The sources include some pretty wild forum posts about this.
Yeah, transcripts from a prominent medical forum, doctors.net.uk, dating back to August 2006. It provides this fascinating window into the profession's internal panic at the time. Doctors were publicly debating the existential threat of autonomous, protocol-driven nursing.
And there is a particularly striking comment from a user operating under the handle Pie Powder.
Right. They were discussing the government's collusion with professional bodies to transfer diagnostic power.
And this user describes the entire initiative as an attempt at an amount of transference of liability sharing the shit bucket.
It is a vulgar way to phrase it, definitely, but it cuts right to the heart of the legal architecture.
It really does. By granting nurses the autonomous power to prescribe, but without providing the rigorous medical education required to do so safely, the administration was performing a sleight of hand.
Right. They get the cheap labor, but who gets the blame?
Exactly. They were maintaining the systemic underfunding and the dangerous 5-minute consultation quotas. But if a patient died from a misdiagnosis, the institution could just point the finger at the individual practitioner. They were pushing the legal and moral liability straight down the hierarchy.
It is the ultimate administrative shield. And Dr. Shree, he refused to participate in that transference of liability. He basically refused to hold the bucket.
Good for him.
Yeah. But because he challenged the structural integrity of their entire efficiency model, the system determined that he had to be eradicated.
Which brings us to the most complex and disturbing section of our analysis today. The document titled The Torturous Conspiracy Case.
Yeah, this is where things get incredibly dark.
I want to spend significant time on this document because the listener who provided these sources specifically asked us to meticulously examine how people in power utilize the bureaucracy to abuse their authority and how they circumvent the very laws they are supposed to uphold.
It's a very important case study.
Right. This isn't just a story about a guy who got fired. It is a blueprint of institutional warfare. So let's break down the mechanics of this retaliation. Who are the actors identified in this legal filing?
The document is extraordinarily specific. It identifies the first defendant, which acts as the legal proxy for the institutional body itself, engaging in a coordinated conspiracy with a network of specific individuals.
Who are they?
It names Mrs. Frida Smitters, Dr. Henderson, Dr. Kahn, Yvonne Ryan, and several others. And this coordinated effort operated systematically over several years, primarily between 2007 and 2010.
So what is the first mechanism of attack outlined in the conspiracy? Because they don't just walk up and hand him a termination notice, right? They have to build a pretext.
Exactly. The foundational tactic was the deliberate eliciting of complaints.
Manufacturing outrage.
Right. The legal files detail how the administration actively encouraged colleagues, subordinates, and even patients to file malicious, entirely unfounded grievances against Dr. Shree.
Because remember the context we just established, the PCT chairman had allegedly tipped off the nurses about Dr. Shree's whistleblowing.
Right, he set the stage for it. The administration essentially created an open-door policy for character assassination. Almost overnight, a physician who had operated with an unblemished clinical record was suddenly buried under an avalanche of coordinated, hostile grievances.
It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. They just overwhelm him with administrative defense. But the document shows they escalated this far beyond professional disagreements about workflow. They attacked his fundamental moral character in the most destructive way a medical professional can experience.
Yes. The vilification campaign reached its absolute nadir with the introduction of fabricated sexual allegations.
That's just repulsive.
It really is. The documents explicitly state that the conspirators allowed and facilitated the circulation of malicious rumors that Dr. Shree had behaved in a sexually inappropriate manner with young female patients.
I really want to pause on that for a second because the psychological violence of that tactic is profound. In medicine, the doctor-patient relationship relies entirely on absolute trust.
It's the bedrock of the profession.
Right. To accuse a physician, especially one who advocates for vulnerable pediatric patients of sexual misconduct, is to attempt to destroy his identity, his community standing, and his psyche all at once.
And the source material from his autobiography emphasizes the immense, suffocating embarrassment and humiliation this caused him and his family.
I can't even imagine.
Now, we must state unequivocally for the record, these allegations were subjected to review by the Clinical Practice Advisory Group, the CPAG.
And what did they find?
They were dismissed entirely. They were found to be completely without foundation. They were ghosts, fabricated out of thin air for the sole purpose of discrediting him.
But the bureaucracy knows that the mere existence of an investigation into sexual misconduct leaves an indelible stain.
Oh, absolutely. It forces the doctor into a defensive crouch and drains their emotional reserves. The rumor is often enough to do the damage.
So once they have attacked his character and forced him to defend himself against these baseless horrors, how do they systematically dismantle his actual ability to practice medicine?
Well, they weaponize the concept of remediation. The administration drafted a document titled a Return to Practice Plan.
Now, normally that sounds like a good thing, right?
Right. In a healthy institution, a return to practice plan is a supportive framework for a doctor who has been on extended medical leave. But in this context, the document was cynically engineered to inherently suggest that Dr. Shree was a clinically inadequate physician who required intense supervision.
They framed him as incompetent.
Exactly. And the most malicious aspect of this tactic was the mandate attached to it. They legally forced him to present this highly prejudicial plan to any future locum agencies or potential employers.
That is a structural trap. They are literally forcing him to carry around his own professional death warrant.
Yep.
He has to walk into a new clinic and hand them a document that essentially says, the NHS believes I am a liability and I need to be heavily monitored. Even though his only actual offense was exposing their diagnostic failures, it ensures he remains completely unemployable.
Exactly. And when the fabricated grievances and the prejudicial practice plan didn't force him to just quit, they moved to overt suspension. In December 2009, they formally suspended his clinical practice.
On what grounds?
Well, the pretext they used was an allegation that he had prescribed an excessive number of amoxicillin capsules.
Amoxicillin, a standard ubiquitous antibiotic.
Yes. And the critical detail buried in the evidence files is that this prescription anomaly wasn't even his action.
Wait, he didn't even write the prescription?
No, it was a clerical error generated by the IT system itself. An error he had absolutely no responsibility for.
Are you kidding me?
But they didn't care about the truth of the clerical error. They just needed a hook to hang the suspension on.
The suspension was merely the mechanism to execute the real goal, which was financial ruin. I mean, the files show that while he was restricted from practicing, they unilaterally reduced his pay in February 2009, without any consultation or due process.
And the culminating strike arrived in August 2010. That's when the administration officially removed his name from the performers group list.
Okay, explain the significance of the performers group list in the UK system. What does that actually dictate?
Right, so inclusion on the performers group list is a strict statutory requirement to practice as a locum doctor, freelance or substitute physician in any specific jurisdiction within the NHS.
Okay.
By unilaterally striking his name from that list, the PCT made it legally impossible for him to work in Hastings or any of the surrounding areas. They severed his ability to generate an income. They aimed not just for his job, but for his actual economic survival.
As I process this chronological breakdown, a massive question emerges about the legal system itself. The UK has the Public Interest Disclosure Act. It has statutory whistleblower protections specifically designed to prevent employers from destroying the lives of people who expose safety risks.
That's true. The laws exist on paper.
Right. So if the law exists, how did the PCT and these administrators execute this conspiracy in broad daylight without triggering immediate legal sanctions?
That question brings us to the most insidious revelation in the torturous conspiracy document. The conspirators didn't operate outside the legal framework. They exploited the loopholes and structural delays within it.
They used the rules to break the rules.
Precisely. If they had simply fired him the day after he submitted his protected disclosure, it would have been a glaring, easily prosecutable case of retaliatory termination.
It would be an open and shut case.
Exactly. So instead, they utilized the sheer mass of the bureaucracy as a weapon of attrition. They subjected Dr. Sri to 7 distinct, overlapping PCT inquiries. 7.
7 inquiries. They trapped him in an endless loop of administrative tribunals.
Precisely. And while they kept him tied up in hearings, the institutions themselves engaged in these elaborate corporate shell games. The legal files heavily reference a mechanism called a 2P transfer.
TUPE. What does that stand for?
It stands for the Transfer of Undertakings, Protection of Employment Regulations. Originally, this is a piece of European labor law adopted by the UK, designed to protect employees' rights when a business changes ownership.
Okay, so if Company A buys Company B, TUPE ensures the employees don't lose their pensions or their contracts.
Exactly. It's meant to protect the little guy.
So how does a law designed to protect workers get inverted to crush a whistleblower?
By using it to launder institutional liability.
Launder liability.
Wow.
Yeah.
The NHS structures underwent various reorganizations during this period. Primary care trusts were being shifted, merged, rebranded. The administrators used these TUPE transfers to essentially scrub their history.
Wait, so the new PCT would say, hey, we didn't do that, the old PCT did.
Exactly. The new administrative entity would absorb the staff, but claim that they were not legally liable for the grievances, protected disclosures, or retaliatory actions initiated by the previous iteration of the PCT.
That is maddening.
They used corporate restructuring to completely obscure accountability. And crucially, this constant shifting and transferring allowed them to stall the internal grievance procedures for years. They were deliberately running the clock until the statutory limitation periods for Dr. Sri to file certain legal claims had expired.
That is institutional sociopathy. They used the complexity of the legal code to run out the clock so that a judge would have to throw the case out on a technicality rather than ruling on the merit of the medical errors he exposed.
It's incredibly cynical.
And the documents note he filed sequential protected disclosures. January 14th, 2008, August 5, 2008, January 6, 2009. He kept trying to sound the alarm, and they just buried the paperwork in the restructuring process.
Yeah, they just kept moving the goalposts.
They even acknowledged that he was subjected to racial abuse during this campaign of harassment, and the administration simply filed the acknowledgement away and took zero action to protect him.
It's a complete abdication of duty.
And then we arrive at the breach of the Caldecott principle. What is the Caldecott principle, and how did they violate it?
So the Caldecott principles govern the handling of patient-identifiable information within the UK healthcare system. Following a major review in the late 1990s, the NHS appointed Caldecott guardians to ensure that patient confidentiality is absolutely paramount.
Meaning you can't just go snooping in files.
Right. You cannot access a patient's medical record without direct clinical justification and patient consent, period.
Okay.
But the court documents reveal that the PCT administration, in their desperate hunt to find literally any minor infraction to build a case against Dr. Sri, deliberately breached this foundational principle. They initiated broad, unauthorized sweeps through his confidential clinical notes.
They were conducting a fishing expedition through the most intimate, protected data a citizen can generate their medical history, just hoping to find a misplaced comma or a typo they could use to fire a whistleblower.
Exactly.
They violated the privacy of the very patients they claimed to be protecting, all to protect their own administrative power.
From a jurisprudential standpoint, the synthesis of all these actions, the fabricating grievances, the punitive practice plans, the unauthorized data breaches, the financial sabotage, it all culminates in a legal concept known as a repudiatory breach of the term of mutual trust and confidence.
Which basically means the employer destroyed the relationship on purpose.
Right. Employment law recognizes that an employer can act with such sustained malice and bad faith that the core contract of employment is fundamentally destroyed. They don't have to formally fire you. They create an environment so legally and psychologically toxic that it constitutes constructive dismissal.
They force the employee to walk away for their own sanity.
They do.
And the human cost of that structural violence is agonizing to read. I mean, in the excerpts from his autobiography, Dr. Sri attempts to articulate the psychological trauma of this decade-long siege. He details the onset of severe anxiety that eventually rendered him physically and mentally unable to work by April 2009.
It broke his health.
It did. He writes about the profound strain placed on his family, watching his life's work be systematically erased by administrators who had never even treated a patient. But the detail that I found most haunting in his writing wasn't his anger, it was his grief.
His grief for the patients.
Yes. He wasn't just mourning his own career. He was mourning the collapse of the ethical foundation of medicine. He writes about the sheer agony of knowing that patients were out there receiving substandard algorithmic care, suffering from misdiagnoses, and completely unaware that the institutions they trusted with their lives were prioritizing efficiency metrics over their safety.
And that response, centering the patient's well-being even while his own life is being dismantled, that is the hallmark of a physician who deeply, fundamentally understands the Hippocratic Oath.
Absolutely.
But the tragedy that the broader source material reveals is that Dr. Sri's ordeal, it was not a localized aberration. It wasn't just a rogue group of managers in one clinic in Surrey. What he experienced is a highly refined, heavily utilized institutional playbook.
Right. The sources expand the scope significantly here to demonstrate that this culture of silence and retaliation is endemic across modern healthcare structures. We aren't just looking at one case. We are looking at a recognizable pattern of behavior.
We have other examples right there in the files.
Yeah, let's examine some of the other whistleblowers detailed in the files to see how the mechanics align. Who is Sharmila Chowdhury?
So Sharmila Chowdhury's case perfectly mirrors the retaliatory architecture we've been discussing. She was a highly respected radiology manager with 27 years of unblemished, dedicated service within the NHS.
A completely stellar record.
Exactly. And in her managerial capacity, she uncovered and reported a massive financial irregularity. She provided evidence that a staggering £250,000 of NHS funding had been illicitly lost due to medical consultants moonlighting.
Meaning what, exactly?
Essentially, senior doctors claiming pay for NHS shifts while they were actually off working in lucrative private clinics. She exposed systemic financial fraud.
Wow. So she protected the taxpayers and the hospital's budget. And how did the institution respond to her diligence?
The playbook was immediately activated. She was abruptly suspended from her role, subjected to a grueling internal investigation, and ultimately dismissed.
Of course she was.
Now, unlike Dr. Sri, she managed to take her employer to an employment tribunal relatively quickly, and she unequivocally won her case.
Oh, she won. That's amazing.
She did. The tribunal found that she had been unfairly dismissed for making a protected disclosure. But victory in court does not equate to a return to normalcy.
Why not? She won the case.
Because the NHS Trust simply refused to reinstate her to her former position. Instead, they utilized another classic bureaucratic maneuver. They claimed they were restructuring the department, and conveniently, her specific job role was erased from the organizational chart.
They legally gerrymandered her out of a career.
Precisely. And the long-term impact detailed in the sources is devastating. Years after her tribunal victory, she remained unemployed, her reputation irreparably damaged within the insular medical community.
That's heartbreaking.
And furthermore, the documents note she was battling cancer, a diagnosis that her own treating consultants explicitly linked to the immense, sustained psychological stress of her treatment as a whistleblower.
The institution didn't just take her livelihood. The stress of fighting them extracted a physical toll from her body.
It's horrific.
And the files show this pattern extends beyond administrative whistleblowing into the realm of clinical research, too. Let's look at the case of Dr. Peter Wilmshurst.
Right, Dr. Wilmshurst's experience highlights how corporate interests intersect with this institutional playbook. He is a prominent cardiologist who was deeply involved in the clinical evaluation of a new cardiac device, a shunt manufactured by a company called NMT Medical.
This was part of a major study, right?
Yes, the INMIAS trial. During his rigorous review of the trial data, specifically examining the echocardiograms of the patients, he noticed a massive, dangerous discrepancy. The corporation was publicly claiming the device was highly effective at closing these cardiac shunts.
But the data said otherwise.
Exactly. Dr. Wilmshurst's clinical analysis showed a significantly higher proportion of patients still had active shunts. He possessed the data proving the device was failing at a rate far higher than the company admitted. So he publicly exposed what he believed to be fabricated and manipulated research.
He acted to prevent a defective cardiac device from being implanted into thousands of hearts. And in response, the corporation decided to bury him in litigation.
They utilized the notoriously strict libel laws of the United Kingdom. NMT Medical launched a barrage of libel lawsuits against him starting in 2007.
Just to shut him up.
Exactly. They didn't necessarily need to win the case on its scientific merits. They just needed to use the courts to bleed him dry financially and emotionally. He was forced to endure years of relentless, incredibly stressful litigation, defending his scientific integrity against a heavily funded courtship legal team.
Until the company finally collapsed and went bankrupt 3 years later. And just to prove that this isn't exclusively a UK phenomenon, the sources briefly mention international parallels. They cite Dr. Raul Pino, a health director down in Florida, who was abruptly suspended by state authorities merely for questioning the vaccination rates of his own staff during a public health crisis.
Yeah, it spans the globe.
It is a universal constant of massive bureaucracies. When an individual challenges the narrative or exposes a vulnerability in the system's primary imperative is to attack the individual, not address the vulnerability.
It creates a pervasive, chilling culture of silence. Every time a whistleblower is publicly dismantled, isolated, and bankrupted, it serves as a deeply effective warning to thousands of other medical professionals.
It sends a message.
A very clear message. If you see a diagnostic error, if you see financial fraud, if you see fabricated research, keep your head down. Process the patient in 5 minutes. Sign the form. Protect your pension.
It reminds me of a powerful analogy that Dr. Shree actually wrote in his notes, comparing the healthcare system to a security apparatus. He wrote that if a security guard leaves the back door of a bank wide open and a syndicate comes in and robs the vault, the guard is an accomplice.
Right, through negligence.
Exactly. The guard didn't physically steal the cash, but by abandoning their duty and leaving the vulnerability exposed, they enabled the crime. In the context of our deep dive, the NHS administration represents that security guard.
They left the door open.
They gave autonomous diagnostic licenses to staff without adequate pharmacological training. They mandated the absurd 5-minute consultation quotas. They created the environment where a receptionist feels pressured to turn away a seriously ill patient. They left the clinical door wide open for these medical errors to occur. And when Dr. Shree pointed at the open door and demanded they close it, the administration turned around and shot the guard who raised the alarm.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the transference of liability we discussed earlier. The institution protects its policies and its executives, allowing the harm to fall on the patient and the blame to fall on whichever frontline worker happens to be holding the checklist when the error occurs.
This entire dynamic reveals a massive systemic clash of ethics. At the granular level, you have the individual physician. They take the Hippocratic Oath. They swear to do no harm. Their ethical mandate is entirely vertical. It connects directly from the doctor to the patient sitting in front of them.
Right, it's a one-on-one bond.
But above them, you have these sprawling horizontal medical institutions, the NHS trusts, the General Medical Council, the various royal colleges. These bodies are not bound by the immediate intimacy of the patient relationship. They are governed by politics, public relations, budgetary constraints, and above all, liability management. And the source material provides a fascinating, deeply researched parallel to demonstrate how these institutions behave when they are forced to confront an ethical reality that their protocols cannot handle. They use the extensive polling data on physician-assisted dying, or PAD, to illustrate institutional paralysis.
It is a brilliant inclusion in the files, actually. because the debate over physician-assisted dying perfectly isolates the friction between evolving public morality, frontline clinical reality, and institutional rigidity.
Oh, so?
Well, when a system relies entirely on established protocols like the NHS relies on triage checklists, it breaks down completely when society demands a protocol for something entirely new and ethically fraught.
Let's look at the numbers provided in the sources because the societal consensus is actually overwhelming here. The 2017 British Social Attitude Survey, which is a highly respected, comprehensive barometer of public opinion, shows that an astonishing 77% of the general public supports physician-assisted dying in cases where a patient is suffering from a painful, incurable disease.
That is a massive majority.
77% is not a margin of error. It is a definitive cultural majority. The public is fundamentally demanding a shift in medical ethics. But when we examine the response of the governing medical institutions,
The institutions are fractured, paralyzed, and in many cases, deeply resistant to acknowledging the public mandate. The sources break down the internal polling of the various royal colleges, and the disparities are incredibly revealing about how different specialties interact with patient suffering.
yeah, the breakdown is fascinating.
Take the Royal College of Anesthetists. Their membership is split almost right down the middle, with 45% in favor of a law change to allow PA and 41% opposed. The Royal College of Surgeons leans slightly toward reform, with 52% supportive of a change in the law.
I want to explore the why behind those specific numbers. Why would surgeons, generally speaking, be slightly more open to this ethical shift?
It likely stems from the nature of their specific clinical practice. Surgeons are fundamentally interventionist. They operate in the acute phase of medicine. They identify a discrete physical problem, a tumor, a ruptured appendix, a failing valve. They intervene surgically to fix it, and the patient recovers, or they don't.
It's very binary for them.
Exactly. When the disease progresses beyond the capability of surgical intervention, when there's literally nothing left to fix, surgeons are perhaps more intimately confronted with the absolute limit of medical utility, making them slightly more receptive to giving the patient control over the end-stage process.
That makes total sense. But contrast that with the physicians who manage long-term decline.
Right. The polling for the Royal College of Physicians and the Royal College of General Practitioners, the RCGP, tells a completely different story.
The sources show that in 2019, 47% of RCGP members voted explicitly to oppose any change in the law regarding PAD. The frontline GPs, the doctors who see these patients year after year as they slowly decline, are heavily resistant. Why the discrepancy?
General practitioners operate in a fundamentally different paradigm than surgeons. They don't just fix acute problems. They manage chronic realities over decades. They build long-term, deeply entrenched relationships with families.
They see the whole arc of a person's life.
They do. So for a GP, the ethical mandate to preserve life and manage suffering is a daily, attritional reality. Introducing the mechanism of assisted dying introduces a profound philosophical conflict into a role built entirely on preservation and management.
It challenges their entire identity as a doctor.
Exactly. But the critical point the source material makes is not just about the individual doctor's opinions. It is about how the massive institutions representing them respond to this division.
Because the institutions can't afford to take a bold ethical stance if their membership is split. It threatens their authority and their cohesion.
Spot on. When faced with this internal division and the overwhelming public pressure from that 77%, the medical colleges engage in institutional hedging. Many of them have officially shifted their stance from active opposition to a highly manicured stance of neutrality.
Very safe.
Very safe. The files note that the World Medical Association, the WMA, engaged in a remarkable piece of semantic gymnastics. They officially dropped the word unethically from their policy statement regarding doctors who participate in PAD where it is legally permitted, but they maintain their official opposition to the practice itself.
They are trying to thread a legally impossible needle.
Yeah.
They are essentially saying, we officially oppose this, but we will stop calling it unethical just in case the law changes and we have to adapt our protocols.
Yeah, it is the ultimate expression of liability management over ethical clarity.
And that brings us to the profound thematic parallel with Dr. Shree's situation. The sources use the PAD debate to demonstrate how massive bureaucratic frameworks operate.
They hate ambiguity.
Right. Just as the NHS mandated protocol-driven, nurse-led triage from the top down, completely ignoring the immediate, evidence-based ethical objections of frontline doctors who are watching patients suffer from misdiagnoses, these same institutions are currently paralyzed by the PA debate.
It's the exact same reflex.
In both scenarios, the individual physician is caught in a crushing vice. On one side, you have the immediate, visceral reality of the suffering patient in the room with you. On the other side, you have a slow-moving, self-preserving bureaucracy that requires a checklist or a protocol before it will allow you to act.
It is institutional paralysis by design. The bureaucracy will always protect its own structural integrity before it protects the anomaly.
Whether that anomaly is a patient whose symptoms don't fit the flowchart, a doctor who points out a flaw in the system, or a society demanding a new ethical framework for dying.
Always.
So this forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. If the human institutions, the primary care trusts, the General Medical Council, the Royal Colleges are so thoroughly paralyzed by internal politics, rigid protocols, and the desperate need to deflect liability, how do we actually protect the patient?
That is the big question.
Because Dr. Sri, after enduring a decade of having his character assassinated, his finances ruined, and his health broken, realized a fundamental truth. He realized he could never fix the NHS from the inside.
No, the system won't let you.
The torturous conspiracy proved that the system would rather destroy him than repair itself. So he stopped trying to change the institution, and he decided to build something that bypassed it entirely.
He took the sheer weight of his diagnostic expertise, the very clinical intuition that the administration had tried to devalue and replace with rudimentary checklists, and he engineered an antidote. He created the Dr. Maya system.
This is the moment in the source material where the narrative pivots from a Kafkaesque tragedy of bureaucracy into an incredibly inspiring story of technological triumph. Dr. Sri didn't just write a book complaining about the system, he coded a solution.
And the conceptual foundation for Dr. Maya was actually patented by Dr. Sri way back in 2003, concurrently with the rollout of the disastrous pilot nurse-led practice.
He saw it coming from the very beginning.
He saw exactly what was happening. Receptionists without an ounce of clinical training were being forced to act as the primary gatekeepers to medical care, arbitrarily deciding who got a 5-minute slot and who was sent away based on flawed administrative protocols.
So what was his core realization?
He realized that if the system was going to refuse to provide patients with an actual clinical examination at the point of entry, the patients needed their own independent, highly trained gatekeeper. They needed a tool that empowered them to know exactly how sick they were before they ever walked up to that receptionist's desk.
Give the power back to the patient.
Exactly. Over the years, this concept evolved, and with the advent of advanced large language models like ChatGPT, it fully manifested into Dr. Maya AI.
Let's dig into the architecture of this AI, because we have spent the last 50 minutes aggressively critiquing the use of generic algorithmic checklists. So the immediate question a skeptical listener is going to ask is, how is an app on a smartphone any different from the flowchart the NHS receptionist is using?
Right. Isn't it just replacing one computer screen with another?
Exactly. Isn't it the same thing?
It is a critical question, and the difference lies entirely in the underlying clinical logic. The NHS protocols were designed to be problem-focused. They anchored on a single symptom to quickly funnel the patient into a treatment pathway.
Like we talked about with the cough.
Yes. If you tell a standard symptom checker on the internet that you have a headache, it will generate a list of 40 possibilities, ranging from mild dehydration to a glioblastoma.
Which just terrifies everyone.
It's useless because it lacks contextual synthesis. Dr. Maya AI, however, was designed to explicitly mimic the rigorous differential diagnostic process of a highly trained physician. And it achieves this by refusing to operate on a single data point. To generate a triage result, Dr. Maya absolutely requires the input of 3 distinct symptoms or signs.
3. Why is the number 3 so vital to the architecture?
It is about filtering out what Dr. Sri terms diagnostic noise. In the reality of clinical medicine, symptoms almost never exist in isolation. They present in distinct clusters, or triads.
Triads, okay.
This is how a doctor's brain actually works during an examination. A fever on its own is just a fever. It could be 1,000 different minor viral infections.
Right.
But if a patient presents with a fever, and they also have a rigidly stiff neck, and they also exhibit photophobia, an extreme sensitivity to light, that specific triad of 3 symptoms cuts through the noise. It is a massive, blaring clinical siren indicating meningitis.
Wow. Okay, so the AI is looking for those specific combinations.
Yes. By forcing the user to identify and input a triad, the AI can cross-reference those data points to emulate true clinical intuition, accurately differentiating a minor self-limiting illness from a catastrophic life-threatening one.
I love how he approached this. Because he felt ethically compromised by a system that was inadvertently harming people through administrative incompetence, he essentially digitized his own pediatric and diagnostic brain.
He really did.
He took decades of recognizing those subtle triads and mapped them into an artificial intelligence. But he also recognized a crucial psychological barrier. If the AI just spits out a complex medical diagnosis like suspected acute cholecystitis, a terrified patient isn't going to know what to do with that information.
No, they'll just panic more.
Right, so he structured the output using a brilliant psychological framework. Cognitive offloading.
Cognitive offloading is essential in emergency design. When a human being is severely ill, or when a parent is standing in a bathroom at 3 a.m. holding a burning hot child, their prefrontal cortex is compromised.
You can't think straight.
No, your brain is flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. In a state of sheer panic, the capacity to process complex medical jargon or navigate a multi-step administrative decision tree drops to near zero. You cannot ask a panicked person to act like a clinician.
Right.
But the human brain, even when fundamentally overwhelmed by stress, retains the primal ability to process and obey simple, color-coded rules.
It leverages the most deeply ingrained societal programming we have. We all know how to navigate a traffic light without thinking about it. Red means stop, green means go.
Exactly. So Dr. Shree mapped the complex outputs of the symptom triads into a strict, instantly recognizable, color-coded triage protocol. When the AI processes the 3 symptoms, it returns one of 4 definitive colors.
Okay, walk me through the colors.
The first is red. Red unequivocally signifies an emergency. If your specific triad generates a red code, the AI's directive is absolute. Bypass the clinic, do not wait on hold for a GP appointment, proceed immediately to a hospital emergency room.
Clear, unambiguous
The
instructions.
second is yellow. Yellow indicates moderate severity. The patient requires professional medical attention, but it is not an immediate threat to life or limb. The system advises consulting a pharmacist or scheduling a routine appointment with a doctor or a trained nurse practitioner.
Okay, what about green?
The third is green. Green is for minor self-limiting illnesses, things the body will fight off naturally. The app empowers the patient to self-manage the symptoms at home, utilize over-the-counter medication, rest, and observe.
This color system alone completely dismantles the chaos of the clinic waiting room we described at the start. If you arrive at the clinic and your app shows a green code, you realize you don't even need to be there. You go home and free up a chair.
Which relieves the pressure on the whole system.
Yes. And if you arrive with a red code and the receptionist tries to tell you there are no appointments left today, you have the objective, clinically validated data to stand your ground and demand emergency escalation. You are no longer reliant on their flawed administrative protocol.
You're armed with clinical proof.
But there is a 4th color in the Maya system. And when I read about its function in the source materials, I realized the sheer genius of Dr. Sree's vision for public health.
The 4th color is blue. And blue is perhaps the most critical innovation in the entire system, especially when we view it through the lens of population health and epidemiology. Blue indicates a high-risk infection triad.
And what does that mean in practice?
The masterstroke of the programming is that a blue code systematically overrides all other colors in the hierarchy.
Wait, I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of that override. If I input 3 symptoms, and one of them is technically a red emergency symptom, but the other 2 complete a blue infectious triad, the app ignores the red and flashes blue.
Correct. Because the logic of epidemiology dictates a different response. If you have a highly contagious airborne infectious disease, say, a novel respiratory virus or a severe strain of influenza, the absolute worst conceivable action you can take for public health is to walk through the front doors of a crowded hospital emergency room.
Because you'll infect everyone else.
Right. You do not want to sit in a poorly ventilated GP's waiting area for an hour, coughing and shedding viral load onto elderly patients, immunocompromised individuals, and the very healthcare workers this system relies on. If the AI detects that specific blue triad, it immediately triggers an isolation protocol.
It acts as a digital quarantine officer.
Precisely. It instructs the user to stay home, isolate immediately from family members, and manage the symptoms remotely. In its fully integrated form, it can even automatically notify local public health authorities to track the cluster, arrange for remote testing, or dispatch targeted medication.
That is just brilliant.
It is designed to act as a firewall, preventing endemics from escalating into pandemics at the very first point of contact, the patient's own smartphone.
It is a breathtakingly elegant solution. Let's contrast Dr. Maya AI with the human triage system that the NHS was so desperate to protect. The human receptionist is exhausted, they are rushing to clear a waiting room to meet an arbitrary patient satisfaction quota, and they might have subconscious biases about how a patient looks or speaks.
Humans are flawed, yeah.
The AI possesses none of those flaws. It cannot be intimidated by a demanding patient, it cannot be bribed, and it doesn't care about the clinic's quarterly throughput metrics. It simply analyzes the clinical data of the triad and objectively tells the patient who they need to consult.
And it is important to emphasize here, Dr. Maya is not practicing medicine. It is not legally diagnosing the specific disease or writing a prescription. It is purely an advanced triage engine.
It acts precisely as the highly trained, clinically competent receptionist that Dr. Shree originally demanded the NHS implement back in 2003.
It is the ultimate technological end run around a hostile bureaucracy.
And in doing so, it fundamentally shifts the balance of power back to where it belongs, the patient. Dr. Shree endured a torturous conspiracy. He watched an institution violate its own laws, breach patient confidentiality, and destroy his livelihood simply to protect its administrative pride.
It's a Dirk story in a lot of ways.
It is, but instead of letting that bitterness consume him, he took the exact clinical knowledge that the NHS attempted to suppress, he codified it, and he distributed it to the public. He effectively validated his original whistleblowing complaints not through a court of law, but through technological proof.
It really is a profound arc.
Yeah.
When we look back at the entirety of this deep dive, we trace a journey that starts in a Surrey clinic in 2003. We see a dedicated physician watching a systemic degradation of care as administrators replace the art and science of the clinical examination with rigid, blind checklists.
Yeah.
We see him adhere to the absolute highest ethical standard of his profession by speaking out to protect the vulnerable.
And we witness the brutal mechanics of institutional self-preservation, the utilization of fabricated grievances, the manipulation of TPE transfers to dodge liability, the weaponization of the Caldecott principles. We see an institution demonstrating that it will always choose to hide its flaws and crush dissent rather than admit a failure that harms the public.
But they ultimately failed to break him. They succeeded in forcing him out of their physical clinics, yes. But in doing so, they inadvertently forced him to innovate in a space they could no longer control.
Exactly. By developing Dr. Maya AI, he democratized the power of the differential diagnosis. He proved that the clinical intuition they deemed inefficient could be mapped, scaled, and placed directly into the hands of the very people the system was failing.
It's an incredible legacy.
It really is. Which leaves us with a truly lingering, provocative question. Think about the massive failures we have unpacked today, the clinical audits full of missed jaundice and wrong prescriptions, the devastating calculated retaliation against whistleblowers, the moral paralysis of the highest medical colleges when forced to confront shifting ethical realities.
Right.
If a piece of software, an artificial intelligence operating on simple, color-coded triads, can demonstrate a more rigorous, uncompromising adherence to the Hippocratic principle of do no harm than the highly paid human executives running our massive medical institutions. What does that fundamentally reveal about the future of healthcare?
It's a question we all need to be asking.
The next time you wake up feeling that deep, terrifying kind of sick, and you find yourself standing at the front desk of a clinic, you have a choice to make. Who would you rather trust to point you toward the right door? A bureaucratic system entirely obsessed with protecting its own reputation and managing its liability, or the algorithmic brain built by the whistleblower who sacrificed his entire career just to make sure you were safe?